Well, I hope you guys are having a good week. We are in week 2 of our part 2. We started last semester going through the book of Genesis, looking at this concept of the lost world of Genesis. That is to say, what are the contexts of an ancient world, an ancient culture, an ancient language that are often lost to us in the modern world? And if we would discover some of those, might these stories in God's word leap off the page to us in new ways than they have before, because we have maybe ancient eyes, we have ancient minds with which to hear this story. And so last semester, and then last week, kind of as a recap, we really focused just on the first 11 chapters. And I was kind of trying to forcefully underscore this idea that the first 11 chapters set the tone for so much of the rest of the story, and I think we'll see that even tonight. But we are turning a corner tonight. We're gonna jump into the 12th chapter. So hopefully that time spent on the first 11 will pay dividends as we come to different passages in here. Before I do that, I want us to set up, I'm going to be talking about Abraham, well-known character to us. But the way that kind of want to get into that is have you ever heard of something called identity-forming stories? You probably know what they are, even if you don't know that title. An identity-forming story is a story that when you go to like a holiday, a family holiday, that story often might get told. When you were growing up, you probably heard that story because it forms something of your identity. I'll give you kind of an example in my family. 1969, my dad, Alan, he's in college. He's just graduated from University of Minnesota in Duluth in northern Minnesota. And at this time, there was a shortage of teachers for schools. And so they weren't requiring people to have an actual teaching degree. As long as you've got a 4-year education, you can teach. And so he wants to be a teacher. He goes out, finds a company that he gets a list of all the schools, like all across America, pays for it. And then he writes about 125 hand-typed letters of requesting, I'm interested in teaching at your school, and sends them out all over the United States. And he hears back from one school in Kodiak, Alaska. That's it. That's it. Well, one day he's sitting in his apartment up in Duluth, Minnesota, and he gets a phone call. Mr. Eklund is calling from Zion, Illinois, and he said, we've got your letter. We would love to have you come teach at our school. And he says, oh, that's fantastic. He's very excited because someone's finally responded. And he said, now, are you familiar? Like, do you like this part of Illinois? My dad said, I love that part of Illinois. He didn't know anything about that part of Illinois, but he was so excited that he might be able to teach there. So he hangs up the phone, and the minute he hangs up the phone, he realizes, I didn't write down the name of the school. I didn't write down the name of the town. I have no idea. It's in Illinois. Of course, there's no, dial callback 1969. So he's just thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And the guy told him, he said, all you need to do, just send me your transcripts and, just like another letter, your application. He said, that's all I need from you and you're in. Well, he didn't remember where to send it or anything. So he's just going, I don't know what. So he said, I've got it. I'll go buy an atlas. And I'll look up Illinois, and I'll start in the A's, and I'll just start going down, and I bet I'll recognize the city. Mind you, the city was Zion, okay? Starts in the A's, then goes to the B's. He said, by the time I got to the D's, I thought, I don't even remember what state I'm from practically now at this point. So he just thought, well, I guess I lost it. I guess it's all for naught. Nothing will happen. And then he said about 5 days later, he got another phone call, Mr. Eklund. And he said, Alan, I don't, your application and information from the school, I haven't gotten it yet. And he said, you're kidding me. That's odd. I'll tell you what, why don't you give me that address again, and I'll go to the school and make sure that they get my transcript sent to you. So this time he wrote down the address, realized, the name of the town, sent it there. My dad was an elementary school teacher. My mom was a middle school teacher. And the year after he got there, they met, and they got married, and they had the most wonderful, beautiful, handsome, witty baby named Brent. It was like a miracle. This is an identity-forming story. Why is that? Because if Mr. Eklund wouldn't have called my dad back, I wouldn't be here. Does that make sense? You probably have identity-forming stories that you talk about. Oh, if this wouldn't have happened, my parents wouldn't have, or if this move wouldn't have happened, I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't have met this person. You get me with that? Identity-forming stories talk about poignant moments that had they not happened, your life would either not exist or it would be so radically different. Abraham. I'm going to submit to you, Abraham is maybe the most important identity-forming story to the Hebrews and to the Jews, certainly to Jesus. Now, how is this the case? Think about this. If you have your physical Bible with you, I've got mine digitally here. If you were to open up the chapters, the pages that Abraham is on, there'd be about 14. I counted my Bible this week. I had 14 pages amidst my big, thick, fat Bible, 14 skinny little pages that are about these stories, these identifying, identity-forming stories. Well, another question, okay, how many times does he get brought up in the rest of the Bible? He's brought up after, in the book of Genesis a lot more, but excluding Genesis, he's mentioned over 115 times in the rest of the Bible going through the New Testament. Why is this so? Then why are these 14 pages so critical? Well, Jesus viewed himself, Jesus viewed his identity, Jesus viewed his story as only making sense because it's within this identity-forming story of Abraham. And if we're followers of Jesus, I would submit to you that we need to understand our own stories, what's happening to us, what can we hope for, what do we do in disappointment, whatever it might be. If our stories are part of these identity-forming stories of Abraham from the 14 pages in the middle of this book. Let me give you kind of an example of someone who had these 14 pages so color their understanding of life that when something critical happened, it immediately burst out. Okay? Jesus' mom. Mary, Jesus' mom, when she's a young girl, Luke chapter 1, verse 46. I want to read this section to you here. Gabriel, the angel, has shown up, told Mary that she's impossibly pregnant. She can't believe this. She goes and visits her cousin, who she finds out is also impossibly pregnant. And she breaks out in a song. She's actually quoting a poem from this woman, Hannah, in the Old Testament, who was also impossibly pregnant with Samuel. It's come to be known as the... From kind of some our Latin traditions, the Magnificat comes from the Latin of the first word is magnifies. My soul magnifies, and so that's kind of what it's come to be known as. Let me read part of it for you here. We read this in Luke chapter 1, verse 46. Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked on the humble estate of a servant. For behold, from now on, all generations will call me blessed." That's a Genesis word that's used a ton there. It'll be used in this passage with Abraham as well. For behold, from now on, all generations will call me blessed, for he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name, and his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. For he has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones, exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy. And then she ends with this. For he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever. See, what she sees God doing when this happens to her, okay, she gets this crazy news, and her first thought is she thinks she connects exactly what's happening with her to Abraham, which is kind of interesting because I'd be like, I wouldn't think of my great-great-great-grandfather the minute something crazy happened to me. But see, the role of these Abraham stories in her life, she sees a pattern in them. She goes, oh, I know those stories, and I know the pattern in those stories, and I'm seeing the pattern play out in my life. Do you see that? And so then she starts to connect it to like, oh, God's acting the same way he did even then. You know, some people say that what happens in moments of crisis, surprise, even trauma, like what comes out of you is the most real thing that you believe. What comes out of her in a moment of crisis, of surprise, is something that she has so worked into her soul. Oh, those stories, those 14 pages, yeah, those set up a pattern that I'm hyper aware of. So when I see the pattern repeated, I make the connection to that. So what comes to her mind, Mary's mind, is, oh my goodness, what God said about Abraham, it's happening. It's happening. What he said way back then, it's happening to me. Let me give you one more example. There was a guy by the name of Isaiah. He's a prophet of the Lord. He's speaking to a bunch of Israelites who are in exile. They're in Babylon. And in Isaiah chapter 51, he writes it, and I love his language here. He's writing to these people in exile to encourage them because they're in a foreign country. Temple's been destroyed. Their homeland is in decay. Isaiah 51, verse 1. Actually, I'm going to jump down. Yeah, verse 1. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek Yahweh. Now, this is interesting. He says, look to the rock from which you were hewn and to the quarry from which you were dug. He's saying, think of the quarry that you were cut from, the family. You're like a stone, okay? And it works really well in Hebrew because the word for rock is eben and the word for son is ben. So they like rhyme. So it works really well here. You're a stone, you're a son. Think about the quarry from which you were cut. Think about that. And then he says, look to Abraham, your father, to Sarah, who bore you. For he was but one when I called him. Okay, that's the problem. He's only one. That I might bless him and multiply him. That's the solution. There's a pattern he's setting up here. For the Lord comforts Zion. He comforts all her waste places and makes her wilderness like Eden. Another pattern. He says, think about Genesis 1. Do you remember how Eden was like wasteful land? You couldn't live there. It's really crummy. And then I made it into a garden. Another pattern. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. What he's saying is think about the pattern of how God has worked. Go back to Genesis 1 and you start with a desert, wasteland, and what do you get? What does God do? God brings a garden out of it. He says, okay, think about Abraham. Abraham was a guy who had no children. He was solo. And what did he do? God made a whole nation from him. So he says, now, okay, there's a pattern established. If your homeland is in ruins, what can God do? See, the God who takes wasteful things and brings beauty and life, that's the God you're worshiping. That's the God you're following. That's the God who owns you. So if you are with him, what can he do to the shambles of your life, to the wasteland of your life? The author's doing biblical theology. He's just thinking, oh, how has God acted in the past? And he knows those 14 pages so well, the Abraham stories, that he goes, it's all over those stories. It's just all over. And I know him so well that I go, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So how will God behave as I pursue him, as I follow him? There is a pattern here. The story of Abraham, okay, those 14 pages, as it comes to us anyway, and it's, final shape in the Hebrew Bible, it's a story for exiles. It's addressed to exile people who are waiting for this new creation promise, waiting for God to fulfill. And when they're waiting, here's what they do. They look back to the stories of Abraham and they see a pattern. And the pattern is that God has done this all throughout history. He's going to faithfully do this going forward. This is just what Mary was tuned into. So she has this chaotic moment in her life, crisis, and she knows the patterns. She knows the ancient stories of Abraham, and she's so dialed into it. She's like, this is part of that. God's being faithful again. So really, this is a story. This is a story about ourselves. It's a story about us. If you're tied into Jesus and therefore into the Abraham story, these stories, these 14 pages that we're going to trudge through, we won't hit them all. You need to see these as your story needs to fit in to that broader story somehow in some way. But it has a meaning into what God's purposes are like right now, right here in our own world. So Abraham, he's linked these stories to God's deeds in the past and looking forward to patterns of what might he do in the future. So all that to say, this is helpful for me to give me a reason why should I spend so much time on these 14 pages? That gives me a good reason to like, oh, okay, I get it. Even if I don't fully get it right now, these stories need to be identity-forming stories for me. And if you read them carefully, they will. And then like Mary, like Isaiah, and these others, when life throws you a curveball, you're still rightly oriented. Does that make sense? That's kind of the purpose. That's sort of the setup for this. Okay. God calls Abraham. Quick thing I want to think about is, what was Abraham's situation, his life, when he's called by God? Because the story doesn't totally set it up for us. But if we go to the end of the book of Joshua, okay, this is like fast forward in Israel's history. They've multiplied. They've been in exile in Egypt. They've come out. They're now in the promised land. Joshua, right before he dies, his last speech that he gives at the very end of the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24. I'm going to read it for us here. Joshua chapter 24, verses 2 and 3, we read this. Joshua said to all of the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." So this is God speaking through Joshua, but it's God. "Long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates. Terah," we're going to get introduced to who that's Abraham's father, "the father of Abraham and Nahor, and this is an interesting phrase, they served other gods." Okay? Abraham is a polytheist. He's a pagan. He's worshiping other gods. He says, "Then I took your father, Abraham, from beyond the river. I led him through the land of Canaan, made his offspring many." And then he goes on kind of summarizing the story. Here's a couple things I just want us to see. Number one, just as we said, Abraham is at this point worshiping multiple gods, other gods besides the Most High God. And the language that God uses here where he says, "I brought him out," it's Exodus language. It's Exodus vocabulary. When he says, "I brought Abraham out of where he was," essentially saying he rescued him from being enslaved to the service of other gods. And he says, "And then I brought him to Canaan." Now, one question that we have to ask is, if you've read the first 11 chapters, like up to this point, there's only one creator God. There's only one Most High God. No one's worshiping anymore. So what happened? How did we go from you're either worshiping Most High God or you're just not, but you're not worshiping other gods? And that's what we hit on last week that I want us to kind of catch up to speed on, because it affixes Abraham in a certain point of what's going on, what has happened. If you remember, what happened in the last chapter was the Tower of Babel, right? Where God finally judges humans. He divorces himself from them. And the language that's used in Deuteronomy 32 is he allots to them, assigns to them, members of his divine council, who at some point in the future, they go off the rails, they rebel, And so where Abraham finds himself is where all of humanity finds themselves at this point in the description of Psalm 82. Here's Abraham's situation. He's in a world where partiality is being shown to the wicked. This is from Psalm 82. The fatherless and the weak are going without justice. The afflicted and the destitute are being taken advantage of by wicked people. They are without knowledge and understanding of the Most High God. Okay? Human chaos. Whatever period of time has passed with God stepping away and these rebellious supernatural beings corrupting the world is in utter chaos. Human culture and society is in utter chaos. They don't know God. It's almost like this. Do you remember Genesis 1 when God comes to this kind of chaotic world and he brings order out of the chaos? Do you know how he does it? It says he separates the waters from the waters, separates the night from the day, separates the land from, okay, that's the vocabulary. He separates and he brings order. What does God do to this family? He separates them from the world they're in that we'll look at. So he's essentially coming to a world of just chaotic humanity. And he's saying, I'm going to bring order, just like I did on pages 1 and 2. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to separate out one family. I'm going to rescue them. Even though I've assigned these other beings, so this one I'm going to take for myself. And he's too old to have kids, and so is his wife, so he's perfect. Because it might be another impossible pregnancy involved. You see the pattern going on here. These are the patterns that cause us to think about it. So God separates this one family. Now we get to the actual text in Genesis. And this is a transition story. In Genesis chapter 11, right? Abraham actually doesn't begin right in 12. He's like introduced at the end of 11. But it's a really important introduction because it sets the story up. So you kind of need to have all this piece here. Genesis chapter 11, verse 27. I'm going to read 27 through 32. We read this. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Let me just pause here for 1 second. In the book of Genesis, this phrase, these are the generations, it's a literary style to like break and say, I'm starting a new story. There's 10 of them throughout the whole book. Sometime, if you're ever reading the book of Genesis, find the 10 and underline them, and you'll know even better than where our editors put chapter breaks. You'll know where there's true story breaks. So there's 5 before this point. There's 5 after Abraham. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered 3 boys, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. However, Haran fathered Lot. That's going to be important, and that guy will be important later. But Haran died in the presence of his father. So the story begins death of a son. In the presence of his father. His father doesn't outlive him. In the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. Oh, that's good. Okay, it's something positive. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, which means princess. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, which means queen. So they're marrying 2 queens. This is good. There's positive here. The daughter of Hera, verse 30. Now Sarah was barren. Ooh, that's a negative thing. The queen can't have children. Verse 31. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, the car broke down. They settled there. The days of Terah were 205. Terah died in Haran. What's going on here? Okay, where are they coming from? Where are they being taken out of? Not being taken out of, they're just leaving. Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Chaldeans is an ancient synonym for Babylon. It's the region. They're living in Babylon, okay, what we just came out of in chapter 11. And then the city they're actually in is Ur, which is kind of a pun because in Hebrew, means fire or oven. So this family is literally emerging out of the oven of Babylon. And they emerged not unscathed. There's a death right at the beginning. So the story's supposed to, they're coming out of the oven of Babylon, but it's again, not unsinged in some way. Sarah's barrenness is going to cause huge moments of crisis, both for Sarah as well as her husband. So we're told about that right away. Where were they going? Do you remember where they were ultimately heading toward? To Canaan. Let me just show you a map and image here so you can kind of get it fixed in your mind a little bit. So if you can see, Canaan is like right this area right here. You probably can't see that thing moving, that can you? If you can find where Israel is, that's Canaan. They're leaving which is on the right side of the map, and they're heading up, and they stop. So they're supposed to do this second leg right here. The second leg doesn't happen because they get stopped in Haran as they're going. And this begins with the death of a son, this interlude, and it ends with the death of a father. And you're supposed to feel that. You're supposed to get it. This interlude is starting, even though they're getting out of Babylon, but it's starting with the death of a son. It's ending with the death of a father. They get stalled halfway through. It's two brothers with queens, but one of them's barren, and they have an orphan with them. Okay? That's the setup of what is going on for this. And the language in this account here, actually this story, it's language that commentators will say it's picking words, and this is one way to connect in the Hebrew mind to something else. It's picking Eden words. Later, Abraham is called the Prince of Canaan. So this is a king and a queen. They're in a place where there's land, there's fruitful, language, being fruitful, multiplying. But commentators also point out that it's like it's an upside down Eden. It's sort of turned on its head. They're married to queens, but they can't be fruitful. They can't do their jobs. Instead of being surrounded by life, like in the garden, what are they surrounded by? Well, the story is surrounded by death of this person and death of that person. So you think about how the story goes itself. And this idea is that Babylon tends to leave the world upside down. Babylon's impact, and Babylon is a world which is essentially culture divorced from God, is the concept. Babylon inverts everything, turns everything upside down. But here's why this is so important. The setup is so important of man, this is crummy. What's going to happen? It poses the reader a question. There's death, there's stuck, there's not life. Here's the big question that is going to lead us into Abraham's life. What can bring new life to a world that's been turned upside down? That's how this ends. That's how this chapter ends. What could bring new life into a world that's been turned upside down? Because the story is death, infertility, death. Ooh, boy, what could go wrong? It already has. Well, the answer is, what could bring new life into a world that's turned upside down is how the very next words start. The call of Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, listen to these words. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. What does it say? Now the Lord said to Abraham. The answer is given to that question. God spoke. God acting is the only thing that can bring life to a world that's turned upside down. Yahweh speaks. Let me read 1 through 5. Now Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, because remember, they're in Haran. They're sort of stopped. His father's still alive. He hasn't died yet. Your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. And him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth. Those are the people from chapter 11 that remember he kind of divorced himself from, put them on the shelf anyway. All of the families, they're going to be somehow looped back in. because the blessing is connected to God's presence. And if they're estranged from God's presence, and he says, I'm going to loop them back into the blessing, that means they're going to get my presence. Now, how is that going to happen? We don't know yet at this point. But this is what is part of the promise to Abraham. So verse 4, so Abram went, and as Yahweh had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was right there's a little bit of a question mark, because he says to Abram, go away from your broader family and leave your immediate family. And then we read, okay, and he took Lot. That should leave a question mark in the reader's mind of, is this guy going to be a problem later? Did he completely obey the Lord? I don't know. He does become a problem later. He brings Lot with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran and took Sarai his wife, Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to the land of Canaan. So they get there. Here's another thing that you're supposed to see. 2 trips have been had so far, correct? First trip, who initiated the trip? Remember the first leg of the trip? Yeah, the father, Abram's father. How did that trip go? Stalled. It's sad because we're even told it starts with the son's death and ends with the father's death. We're supposed to see it as a mess. We're supposed to see leg 1 as a mess. Leg 2, it's echoing leg 1. It's the same thing. We're going to go to Canaan this time. It's sort of like part 2 as they're trying to go. And so this son's trip, again, it looks almost exactly like it. There's almost nothing different to it, except there's one difference. If you reflect on these two, if you go back and you read leg 1 and leg 2 of the trip, and they look almost identical to what's happening. Takes his family with him and goes, takes his family with him and goes. The only one difference is the word of God. It says, God spoke. Leg 2, God came and said, here's what I want you to do. Why is this important? Because these 2 options will be posed to Abraham the next 14 pages. He's constantly going to be in a scenario where are you going to forge your own way? Are you going to rely on your own wisdom? Or are you going to rely on, it's the same destiny. Go to Canaan. How about this one? I'm going to give you a child. Are you going to wait on me for it? Or are you going to forge out in your own way and do it? You're going to accomplish the same end, you think. But will you wait for me? That's the huge question, the rest of this book. And even the other characters. God will constantly come and say, here's something I'm going to do in my timing. And they go, that's a cool thing. I could help you along, God. That is the great test of the rest of the story. And these 2 legs of the trip exemplify you've got 2 options. You can do it your own way, your own strength, your own wisdom, or you can wait on God. I think of the very well-known passage from a book of Proverbs. We read this, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Probably some of you guys could say it without even reading it. Trust in Yahweh with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways, acknowledge him. That is, put him in the right place of rule. And he will make straight your paths. Those 2 trips that you can pick, do you want the one that is straight? You've got to wait on the Lord. Or do you want the one that you forge out on your own and see how that goes? That's how we're being introduced to these 14 pages that are identifying or identity-forming stories for Israel, for Jesus, for us. How did Jesus live his life constantly? He said things like, I have only done what the Father has told me to do. I've only said to you what the Father has revealed to me. He's saying constantly, those 2 paths, I'm doing this one. I'm pursuing the kingdom of God, but at his timing, his way, his method. I'm not forging out on my own to do it. I'm not trying to accomplish the good end in my way. And this is the great challenge, I think, in the human life itself. So thinking about these promises real quickly here. Genesis chapter 12, God makes several promises to Abram. And he says to him, go from your country, from your kindred, your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will give you a great name. I will bless you. And then through you, I'm going to bless all the families. I'm going to loop the rest of the nations into it. A great nation. So this first promise right away seems questionable, because what did we learn about Sarah? Yeah, there's no nation coming out of her, right? Unless there's some impossible pregnancy. So here's the promise, great nation. You're going to be many. In fact, this promise is sort of reiterated just a little bit later on, and God adds some things like, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. This is a person who lives in the desert. You know how much dust he's looking around and seeing? See all this stuff that you can't even get rid of? That's going to be your descendants. That seems impossible. How could I? I'm solo. That's the problem. We can't do that. And then he says, I will give you a great name. This is a Bedouin herdsman who just roams from place. Abram doesn't even own land. You realize that? He just moves around with his flocks. Now he starts growing and getting more, and he becomes wealthy. This person doesn't even own property. So how is he going to be this person, this great name? He's come out of Babylon, one of the greatest cities ever created. In fact, we're told the guy who built Babylon, his name is Nimrod. He's the guy who built the city that he came out of. And Nimrod was known, in fact, it's said of him, he had a great name. Interesting, isn't it? Which means it's this idea that people just love to say it. It's like, whoever the coolest sports hero is today. My day was like Michael Jordan. Just talking about that person, you're like, yeah, they're awesome, right? That's the idea. Someone who has a good name is like, people just want to be like them. They want to talk about them. Mentioning them, they carry gravitas. You know what I mean? They're significant. That's who Nimrod was. He was a great hunter. He built this city. And Abraham comes out of that city as a little guy who's got herdsmen. And he says, I'm going to make your name great. Here's another contrast. There are two ways to go about doing life. Either you working on making your name great. Do you remember what the people who came to Babel said? Let's build a city so that we can make a great name for ourselves. Yeah, that's one way to do life. When you work at giving yourself a great name. The other way to do it is by saying, God, you give me a name. Give me my identity. I'm going to find it in you rather than me trying to sort of posture and create one. Again, there are all of these sort of like, here's two ways to do life, guys. And Abraham gets presented with it. We get presented with it. Here are two ways to do your identity. Here's two ways to make decisions in life. Here's two ways to pursue the good. Here's two ways to pursue what you think God wants for you. There are many different ways to do that. And then he says, I'm going to bless you. Blessing, in this context, it certainly was in Genesis 1. The word blessing was always associated with being fruitful, accomplishing what God's called us to do, be fruitful and multiply. And then, of course, the big one is that Abraham is going to become, he says, through you, you're a conduit. Through you, I'm going to bring back the blessing that was lost. It was lost in Genesis 1. It's screwed up in Genesis 6. And it's almost totally taken away in Genesis 11 at Babel. He says, I'm going to bring back the blessing to my world that's on the shelf for now, away from me. They've been judged, but I'm going to bring that back to them. So what's the goal for Abraham and the Israelites? The goal is that they would live in such a way, the word Torah means way, okay? They would live in such a Torah, such a way that the nations would see it and say, man, that's so wise. Ooh, that's so good. Life looks good for them. Who's the God that's overseeing them? Because my God is chaos. That people would see the way the Torah, that the descendants of Abraham live, and they would be attracted to it. They would go, man, I want to find that. I want to seek that. Which is exactly what, listen to the words of the Apostle Paul. This is one of my favorite passages. In Acts chapter 17, Paul's speaking to one of these nations that's under another god. Listen to the story he tells them. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. This is in the middle of a long story. He says, he made from one man every nation of men. Okay, we know what that is. Yeah, there's one person that ever came from them. To live on the whole face of the earth. He determined, now look at this word, allotted. What does that come from? Remember, God allotted people to these sons of God. He allotted the gods to them. When he set up the boundaries of their dwelling, that's Babel. When he separated everyone, okay? He's talking about back then. Why did he do that? What was the original plan? That they should seek God, perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Isn't that interesting? There was something about that setup, didn't go very well, but something about that setup, if Israel would be faithful, if they would live these lives of holiness, of righteousness, that were so compelling that the nations would go, man, I want to seek out, what is that? And they would find God. They'd find the Most High God. Now, that did happen. We have stories in the Old Testament of these pagans who would come and say, the Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon and says, this wisdom you have, tell me more about it, right? Rahab, this harlot, says, your God's the real deal. I want in. There's name after name of person who was under a foreign god. They saw the truth, the beauty, the goodness, and they sought out. They were like seeking. Psalm 82 says they're like walking about darkness, so they're kind of feeling about, I don't know the real God. But if Israel would be who they're called to be, they're going to be like a magnet to the world. And of course, Israel is unable to do that very well, unable to do it perfectly at all. And so the hope keeps coming that one day there will be one person who will be faithful. Israel's not faithful, and so finally God says, okay, maybe just, how about the leader, the king? If the king's faithful, I can still accomplish this through you. And you get a guy like David, great start, and then just runs into the ground, right? We need a faithful Israelite who can do this, who these two roads, you can take this one or you can take that one, never takes the wrong road. Who could that be? That's the person of Jesus. Jesus is the perfect Israelite. He's the perfect human, and he's God-made man. He comes, he lives the perfect life in our place, and then offers that to us, and then offers and says, I'll loop you into my story. The thing that you can't do on your own, I'll loop you in to what I'm doing. And I'm actually, by the way, I'm going to loop all the nations. I'm going to reclaim the nations for the Most High God. And so he's given that authority. And I would suggest to you, do you know what is the most identity-forming story? It's not those 14 pages. It's the pages that accomplish this. The reason we take the bread and the juice, you know why we do it? Because we're reminding ourselves of my story, my little frail, messed up, dirty story. It fits into the most significant identity-forming story that ever happened. The birth, the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of the Most High God. That he came into his story, and then he loops us in. So when I take this, I'm reminding myself I've been looped into that story. There's a pattern that he started a long time ago in creation, pattern that I'm seeing with those 14 pages of Abraham and stuff. And there's a pattern with the coming of the king. And so my story will intersect that pattern someday. It already has, but it will fully someday. I'm in for that. That's why the Apostle Paul says every time you do this, you declare his death in the past, the pattern, and you look forward until he comes again. the pattern's going to be fulfilled. So I want to do this. I'm going to ask Kayla to come, and I want us to sing a song which is, I don't know if there's anything better we could say. Lord, I am in need of you. That's a good declaration, wouldn't you agree? Lord, I'm in need of you. And during these next 2 minutes, hopefully you have the communion elements. If not, you can get up and go grab some. I want you to just personally reflect on this fact of your need for God, but his great love for you, of what he has done. And then at the end of this, I'll come back up and we'll all take them together.
Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. For your holiness is Christ in me. In me, Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. It's every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Lord, I need. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. And it's every hour I need you. My one defense and my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. You are my one defense and my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you.
Would you please stand with me if you're able? In that one great identity-forming moment when Jesus was betrayed just the night before, he sat at a meal, and he took the bread, and he broke it. He says, this bread, it's my body broken for you. Take and eat. In the same way, after the meal, he took the cup. He says, this cup is my blood in the new covenant. Take and drink. And again, as often as we do it, we proclaim his death in the past until he comes again in the future. And now a benediction before you go. Romans 11:33 and 36. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments. How inscrutable his ways. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Amen. Love being with you guys. Thanks for being here. Thanks for pressing in. Have a great rest of your week. Stay warm. I'll see you next Wednesday.